Colombia's largest rebel group, the FARC, announces it will release what it calls its remaining prisoners of war and calls again for talks to end the country's civil war. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. Colombia's FARC rebels, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, has announced it will free what it calls prisoners of war. The country's largest rebel group still holds 10 police and soldiers, some of whom were captured 14 years ago. Hundreds of civilian hostages are thought to be in their custody. The group's leaders called for negotiations to end a civil war which has spanned almost half a century. It didn't promise an end to hostilities with the government. President Juan Manuel Santos described the move as an important step, but not enough to start peace talks. His predecessor, former President Álvaro Uribe, who was responsible for a major crackdown on the rebels, dismissed FARC's words as trickery. The rebels have been staging a number of attacks in the country. Local media have reported a number of soldiers have been killed in the last 24 hours. So does that announcement by Colombia's FARC rebels make talks to end the country's civil war a possibility? What does the future hold for the group? To discuss that, I'm joined live from Bogota by political analyst Jorge Restrepo, and here in the studio by Virginia Bouvier, who works on Latin America for the United States Institute of Peace, and by Jose Miguel Vivanco, director of the Americas Division for Human Rights Watch. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's look at the news out on Monday. FARC saying that it will stop kidnapping people and that it will free remaining hostages. Now, they have issued a very lengthy statement. Here's part of that statement in which the group declared that much has been said about the retention of people, men or women, of the civilian population for financial ends for the FARC to sustain our fight. With the same will expressed before, we announced that from this date, we forbid this practice in our revolutionary conduct. Virginia, looking at that statement there, now we know that the FARC has used kidnapping as a tactic for a very, very long time. So how significant is this announcement? Well,
this is a major step forward if indeed the FARC does comply with it, which many people are hopeful will happen. The international community and actors within civil society in Colombia and government have been pushing very hard for a very long time to secure just this kind of commitment. I think it's still early to see what it means, but I think that we need to accept it at face value for now and move ahead, and hopefully the Santos government will look at it positively, and we'll see it as a building block.
It is a major change, though, isn't it?
It is a major change. It's the first time that we know of that the FARC has made such a statement. It's not completely unanticipated. Senator Piedad Córdoba and a group called Colombianos y Colombianas por la Paz has been pushing very hard to get just this commitment and has been announcing for a while now that there would be a release of hostages, which is also addressed in this letter by the FARC, and that there would be an announcement of the end to the practice of kidnapping.
Okay, Jorge Restrepo, there we heard that, a major statement from FARC, a major change there. What has been the response in Bogota?
I mean, it has been very mild, I will say. It was not greeted with great, happiness or a little bit of incredibility. A lot of the analysts and political parties and political actors, as well as the government, has say that they need to wait and see, and also mention the fact that this could be another case of an announcement that is never, applied or complied by the FARC. Then it's a little bit of incredibility here. I will say that is the mood in the city.
Okay, Jose Miguel, I mean, there we heard it, there seems to be some kind of a trust deficit here when it comes to negotiations between the Colombian government and FARC. So how should we be looking at this?
I think the FARC has very little credibility in Colombia, and as well as outside Colombia. It's not just a question of lack of trust between the government and this organization. This is an organization that engage on systematic atrocities and profit on narco-trafficking and abduction. Also recruit minors as part of their practice. So, this organization really has a very, very low capacity to persuade the general public in Colombia.
But there was also a time when the FARC was saying that the government of Alvaro Uribe was not acting in good faith, was not negotiating in good faith.
Well, you know, the government of Uribe actually never really pretend to negotiate with the FARC. The government of Uribe openly and publicly engaged on use of military force to basically deliver the capitulation of the FARC. And I think, you know, during the Uribe administration, the military forces were able to gain a lot of ground from military perspective against this organization. That is perhaps one of the reasons why today the FARC are asking for.
Would it be fair to say that there were human rights violations and abuses on both sides?
The violations of human rights are committed obviously not only by the FARC but also by security forces, sometimes in conjunction with paramilitary organizations in Colombia. The record of human rights in Colombia is pretty poor, and I believe that everybody has direct responsibility on different type of atrocities.
Virginia, what does this announcement tell us about FARC itself? You know, at its height, it was reputedly supposed to have something like 20,000 members. We hear different figures right now, 8,000, 10,000, 9,000. It's all over the place. But does this tell us that the FARC has been significantly weakened?
I think there's no question the FARC has been significantly weakened. I think we have a very different situation today than we had 10 years ago when the government of Andrés Pastrana initiated peace talks with the FARC, and after that period, I think we've had a period where negotiations and the shadow of Caguán was so difficult for the Colombian population to deal with and the governments to deal with that the whole idea of negotiations has been pretty much removed from the table as an option for the last decade. I think now what we're seeing, the FARC is much more weak. Militarily, they say 8,000, but the numbers don't matter too much. Right. I think everybody agrees that the FARC is military weakened. I think that there was a sense 10 years ago as well, that if you could weaken the FARC militarily, you could bring them to the peace table. I think this has been the line that we've heard from governments for decades now in Colombia. The problem is that there's never an identified end game. There's never a point that they say, at this point, we know they're weak enough to come to the negotiating table.
Well, I guess that calls into question exactly what was the FARC fighting for. Did they achieve anything?
Well, I guess it depends who you speak to. If you go back to the early agendas of the FARC, which were centered on agrarian reform issues, political, social, and economic reforms, I think you could actually say that much of what the FARC was demanding in its early days are just part of modernizing a nation. I mean, we have a decentralization process that's taken place under various democratically elected governments in Colombia that responded to some of the concerns that the FARC had early on. You've had the 1991 Constitution implemented that broadened kind of liberal human rights options and opportunities for the Colombian populace. The question of inequities and kind of unequal distribution of wealth. Colombia is the third worst country in terms of the scale of unequal distribution of wealth. So I think some of those issues, the kind of socioeconomic issues, have not been addressed. But the kinds of political agenda issues that they've put on the table, I think have been taken up by and large by civil society.
Right. Let me ask Jorge Restrepo about that. Jorge, what's the view from Bogota? You know, do Colombians feel that, you know, the FARC has a valid point, it has valid grievances? Have any of those grievances been addressed?
I wouldn't say that there is any support politically for the FARC, or not even at a region or peasants in a particular region that will feel that the FARC has become their champion of their causes. I will say rather that the FARC is completely sidelined politically and it doesn't have a space. Then precisely these type of moves, which are quite smart from the viewpoint that they appear to be publicly negotiation with the government, they do open political space to the FARC. But nevertheless, they have a political role, if you wish. They have political power coming from guns and from violence and from the capacity to isolate entire areas and to influence and even control those areas. Then nowadays the FARC, it's an organization that do have an aim, which is to maintain themselves. They do themselves that they've been militarily weakened, and the government and the Colombian society knows that they've been defeated. But nevertheless, it does not mean that we have achieved peace. Then this military strategy that we agree occurred and weakened the FARC strongly hasn't brought about peace. And that is the big problem that we have in Colombia right now. We won a war, but we haven't achieved peace.
Yeah, okay, what do you think?
But I think it's important to also understand that in order to achieve meaningful peace negotiation anywhere in the world, you need to create those conditions. And if we are dealing with any guerrilla organization that has the expectation to keep growing and developing its strategies, political or military strategies, without any constraints, I think it's very difficult to get to the table and negotiate any agreement. They have no reason, really, no incentives to show up.
Are you saying that theirs was not a just cause?
What I'm saying is that the FARC, what we have today in Colombia, is an organization that engage on serious human rights violations, use prohibited weapons under international humanitarian law, that recruit minors, that terrorize civilians, that don't make any distinctions between combatants and civilians, and they were the champions of the world at some point on abductions, only thanks to the use of military force that they have been forced to scale down.
Is a more comprehensive peace settlement, because there are fighters on the other side, the right-wing paramilitaries, groups that were created by wealthy ranch owners and farmers to fight against FARC. So you'd probably need a far more comprehensive peace to see.
Yes, but I don't think they are part of any kind of negotiation. I mean, paramilitary organizations today in Colombia, unfortunately, are a serious reality, probably the most serious threat to public security. Is created by paramilitary organizations, but those are basically mafias and organized crime that are linked to narco trafficking. Right. So I hope that at some point the government of Colombia takes this challenge seriously, and in the same way that they have shown some strength going after the FARC, decided to do a similar strategy against paramilitary organizations that have been always off the hook in this kind of process.
Virginia, you've done some work in this field. What would the contours of a peace settlement look like? I mean, here we have FARC saying, look, we want talks with the government, we want peace talks, we want to end this violence, etc. What would it look like? I mean, is it simply going to be the government saying, look, there is a system in place here already, put your weapons down, join the system, that's the only one on the table?
Well, I think, first of all, that if there's a process that takes place, the Colombians will have to define what that will look like. I think there are a number of elements that have emerged that suggest the contours of what parts of it would look like. First of all, I think there's a real difference between the peacemaking and the peace building. The peacemaking being sitting the negotiators for the FARC down, or the ELN. There is another guerrilla group that maybe we can talk about afterwards, sitting them down with government officials to come up with some sort of solution that everybody signs off on, and that's the peace accord. Well, it used to be done that way in the olden days. But I think more and more civil society has become a really key player in designing what a peace process would look like, and deciding what the peace building would look like. And the peace building is what happens after you have this accord. What kinds of changes need to be made in the broader society to ensure that guerrillas don't emerge once again, and you don't have the kind of reincidence of violence and of civil wars, or internal armed conflict, as it's called in Colombia. And so there needs to be some structure where, yes, the government and the guerrillas need to sit down and talk, but there needs to be a broader discussion of what's needed in the Colombian context so that the war can actually be put behind them and they can move ahead.
But Virginia, one of the, I think, pretty predictable demands of the FARC is going to be an amnesty for atrocities, for human rights violations. And unfortunately, since there is a precedent,
We have had
I'm not so
amnesties
sure of that.
in the
I'm
there
not
is a
past.
precedent of some sort of special concessions,
not
incredible
so sure.
concessions made by the government of Uribe in favor of paramilitary organizations. They might be looking for some special treatment on something that the experts call transitional justice, legal framework that will allow the FARC to give up their weapons in exchange for some sort of a special treatment with regard to human rights investigations. That is a real risk.
But I think that is one of the issues that needs to be talked about in dialogues. I think the government and the insurgents need to sit down, and they have said, when asked what their agenda would be, human rights and international humanitarian law are one of the items on their agenda. Now, what that means and how that might be defined, I think is open for question. The fact that you have a victims' law and a law for restitution of lands currently underway, if that's successful, that may give the victims more power in this discussion. It may create a civil society movement that will not allow an amnesty to be put forward as part of the negotiations. That's why I think that it's really important that the negotiations or the dialogues go hand in hand with a broader conversation among the entire
Jose Miguel,
society.
when we talk about amnesty and the surrender of weapons, etc., is that now complicated by the fact that there's a body of international law now that determines whether that can happen? There's international courts. For instance, we have the United States and the European Union, for instance, which refers to FARC as a terrorist organization.
Sure, and the good news is that we have an international criminal court that, according to its treaty, abductions, for instance, are considered crimes against humanity. So it will be very difficult for the government to make concessions on this point. But I have no doubt in my mind, Virginia, that those fellows who were ordering killings, disappearances, massacres, as well as abductions, and protecting those, the perpetrators of these type of crimes, are not going to be willing to serve a single day in prison for those type of atrocities. And they will look for something, some kind of quid pro quo, agreement with the government. And I hope that Colombian society is going to be firm, together with the, judiciary in Colombia, supporting the rule of law and not a special treatment, which is unfortunately the practice in Colombia historically.
Let's go back to Jorge Restrepo in Bogota. Jorge, we've been listening here to the prospects for peace. And I was just wondering, is there the political will on the part of the Colombian government to enter into talks with FARC right now? Or does it feel we hold all the cards right now? This is a weakened organization. We can have it our own way if we just sit this out.
That will be precisely the feeling. I mean, I reckon the response of the Santos government is a response from a powerful position. We have to remember as well that he has been, and his government has been subject to very strong criticisms for what I would call a marginal deterioration of security, both in urban and rural areas. Then he also has a need to show that he's strong and tough against the guerrillas, the narco-traffickers, the new paramilitary groups, which are the old paramilitary groups, and all that kind of violent groups that populate the Colombian countrysides and even affect the cities. Then the political space for a settlement or even for opening up a public negotiation, it's quite reduced. I agree that we have moved forward a lot in terms of peace building at the local level and at the ground, especially in rural areas. But there are nil infrastructure for peace, to use the term of Kofi Annan. I mean, we don't have enough experts, think tanks, organizations, opinion makers, and people that are investing in trying to bring forward purposeful and useful negotiation with the FARC. And I have to say as well that the FARC, again, they don't have the political capacities, for example, to name several negotiators or people that will be the spokespersons for their demands, which are very difficult to steal and to pinpoint. And I will add a little bit of, which I think it is a very important point, the fact that the FARC itself has destructured. It is an organization that nowadays is trying to fight for a centralized command and control. The position of Timoshenko, which is the leader that issued this communique, is not necessarily shared by Ivan Marquez or by the other strong leader of the FARC, which is Pablo Catatumbo.
Right.
And in a way, they are fighting a war in Catatumbo. It's fighting a much more vicious war in Cauca, and it's trying to hold negotiations from the middle of the Magdalena. Then it's not a centralized voice, the one that we are hearing now.
Well, I have one other question. You mentioned there that the political space is very narrow, but what about public opinion in Colombia? Does it favor the government going into negotiations? Does it favor a settlement? What kind of impact has this very long war had on Colombia?
I mean, the first impact is that it has made the political agenda an agenda that doesn't take into account the root causes of conflict. I mean, both Virginia and Jose Manuel were talking about inequality, human rights violations, which are very serious for Colombia, but those are topics that, although belong to the political, the center points that need to be the center points of the political discussion, they are not. And that's thanks to the fact that we had had for more than 40 years this very serious conflict going on.
Okay. Virginia, the response from the government has been very lukewarm. The current president, Jose Manuel Santos, said, well, yeah, we've heard them, we've heard what they've said, but it's not enough. There's got to be a lot more done before we will enter into negotiations. Is that simply a negotiating tactic on the part of the government, or are they saying, we're just going to set this up?
Well, the Santos government, when it first came in, was greeted by the previous leader of the FARC with an invitation to dialogue. And at that point, he said he had a key for peace, and it would be used when certain conditions were met. And he listed a whole series of conditions, which included stopping kidnapping and releasing hostages. There were a number of other ones, stopping terrorist activity, stopping landmines, releasing child soldiers, ending the war, ending the environmental degradation. The list was fairly generic. So I think one of the issues is that you can't, this is kind of a war in the public discourse, in the public domain. And one has to presume that there is a private domain where these ideas are being discussed and there's some sort of strategy. One hopes that there's some sort of strategy for moving ahead where Santos is beginning to think about, if he hasn't already come up with, something that he can offer in return to say, we think this is a very good move. We'd like to see it verified and monitored to make sure that it's actually happening. And if in fact it is being followed, we are willing to give this part. I think when you think about peace talks, you have to think about two sides.
Right.
It's not just that unilaterally the FARC is going to give everything that the government has asked for before they even get to sit down and talk at the table. That seems a little bit out of proportion. I think you have to go back and say, okay, what are the measurable objectives of each side? And is there a way that you can sequence them in a way that would continue on the path and create a momentum toward an end goal, which presumably would be a peaceful negotiated settlement.
But that is the first reaction of the government of President Santos, and I think it's perfectly legitimate that the government requests some sort of ceasefire. To stop the attacks on the civilians and the use of force by the FARC. We will see how the FARC is going to react. I mean, this is.
But there is a problem of trust there, isn't there? Because just in the past few weeks, when FARC said that it will release a number of soldiers that it was holding, that was abandoned because it said that the government had, in its words, militarized the situation. In other words, they'd sent soldiers and surrounded the place where the exchange was going to take place.
Well, the government of Colombia, like any other democratic government, has not only the right but also the duty to try to release those individuals who are under abduction by irregular armed groups. So if you expect that the government is going to just wait and see for them to deliver and to release these hostages, I don't think that is a reasonable demand.
Okay, that is where we're going to have to leave it.
Okay.
Time has caught up with
Great.
us, and that is it from the Inside Story team here in Washington, D.C. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at InsideStory@aljazeera.net.